Hello everybody, welcome back. Today we're looking at the first part of Chapter 17, Section 5, The War Ends. There's a lot of information in this section and in this lesson, so I split it into two parts because there's just way too much to try and cram into just one lesson. So today we'll be following our essential question of what effect did the Battle of Gettysburg have on the Civil War? So today we'll look at the Battle of Vicksburg, but we'll spend the lion's share of our time looking at the Battle of Gettysburg and how those 3 days really impacted the Civil War as a whole and showed that the South just was not going to be able to win going the way that they were. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's take a look at our key terms for today. And today we will be discussing siege, along with that, the Battle of Gettysburg, and within the Battle of Gettysburg, Pickett's charge, which, as you can see, was the climax of the battle. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. So siege, Battle of Gettysburg, and Pickett's charge. And as we get started today, I want you to click to download the worksheet, and when you do, this will pop up. And it's our worksheet that will help you out today as well as in the next lesson when we continue through looking after the Battle of Gettysburg. For this first part, you can see these are either true or false statements. So as you go through, you're not going to get to all of them today, but as you go through, I want you to mark the statement either true or false. And if it's false, you can see there's also a line underneath where you need to do something to change it to make it a true statement. So it's not enough just to say this is true and this is false. You need to take the false statements and correct them to make them true. And please, if you don't understand or if something's like, I don't quite get that, let me know before you hand it in tomorrow. So keep this as we go through today's lesson as well as tomorrow's lesson. And you will have to turn it in after that. Okay? Now on to the Battle of Vicksburg. First up, let's talk about Vicksburg. We know that from previous discussions that the Unions had control of the northern part of the Mississippi River and the southern part, but the Confederates still controlled Vicksburg, Mississippi, which was kind of cutting off those Union forces. So in 1863, General Ulysses S. Grant tried multiple times to take Vicksburg, but the Confederates still held it. Finally, Grant came up with the idea to march his troops inland, and after attacking Jackson, Mississippi, he turned on Vicksburg from behind. So Grant laid siege on Vicksburg for 6 weeks to try and force the Confederates to surrender. And eventually, with the victory at Vicksburg and later at Hudson, Louisiana, the entire Mississippi River was under Union control, which now cut Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana off from the eastern part of the Confederacy. Vicksburg fell on July 4th, 1863, and citizens of Vicksburg refused to celebrate Independence Day until well after World War I. Talk about holding a grudge.
Gettysburg was not the only disaster the Confederacy was to suffer during July of 1863. In the West, Grant had been trying to crush a major Confederate stronghold, the city of Vicksburg. The Confederate General Pemberton was in charge of the city's defense. He wrote to Jefferson Davis and said, "I intend to hold Vicksburg to the last. I conceive it to be the most important point in the Confederacy." Day and night for 6 weeks, General Grant's Union forces had rained a terrible storm of shot, shell, and mini bullets upon the city of Vicksburg. Inside the city, food was scarce, and people's nerves were raw from the ceaseless Union bombardment. On July 3rd, one citizen of Vicksburg wrote,
"Provisions are so nearly gone. Martha says that rats are hanging breast in the market with mule meat. There is nothing else." An officer at the battery told me he had eaten one yesterday.
On July 4th, General Pemberton's 31,000 Confederate soldiers, who had been Vicksburg's only line of defense, surrendered. Vicksburg had fallen just one day after Lee's defeat at Gettysburg. This gave Union forces complete control of the Mississippi River and divided the Confederacy in two.
Now, while Grant was marching through the West and laying siege at Vicksburg, the Union forces were having a lot of trouble with the Confederates under General Lee in the Eastern Front. After Lee's victory at Chancellorsville, he took his army north into Pennsylvania to try and surprise the Union forces, as well as gain some much-needed supplies. He planned on destroying the railroad bridge at Harrisburg, then turning his attention to Philadelphia, Baltimore, or Washington, D.C., if whatever deemed necessary. And after the long march north, Confederate troops were spread from Chambersburg through Carlisle and into York.
The future of the United States was decided on this Civil War battlefield. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a small town at the crossroads of American history. In 1863, Gettysburg had a population of about 2,400. The 10 roads that met in the center of town made it a frequent stop for traders and travelers on their way to Washington, D.C., Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and Richmond, Virginia. In the days leading up to July 4th, 1863, these same roads would bring more than 165,000 Union and Confederate soldiers to fight bravely and leave behind more than 45,000 casualties. Gettysburg, its citizens, and the United States of America would never be the same. June 1st, 1863. Confederate General Robert E. Lee launched a second invasion of the North with his 75,000-man army. The residents of Gettysburg heard the news. The rebels are coming. Lee hoped to score a decisive victory in Northern Territory and was leading his troops toward the city of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, on a road through Gettysburg. Free African Americans packed their bags and headed farther north to avoid capture by the Confederates. Those who stayed behind hid their valuables, stockpiling food and supplies. On July 1st, Lee's army entered Gettysburg on a reconnaissance mission.
I never saw a more unsightly set of men. I pitied them from the depths of my heart. They excited my sympathy and not fear, as one would suppose. I wondered what this coming meant, what they were going to do, and how long they were going to stay.
Gettysburg residents met the arrival of Union troops with relief.
I had never seen so many soldiers at one time. They were Union soldiers, and that was enough for me, for then I knew we had protection, and I felt they were our dearest friends.
There were enough soldiers here to whip all the Rebs in the South.
I remember hearing some of the soldiers remarking that there was no telling how soon some of them would be brought back on the stretchers. I hardly knew what it meant, but I learned afterward, even before the day had passed.
July 1st, 1863. Lee's scout, Lieutenant General J.E.B. Stuart, failed to report enemy positions. As part of A.P. Hill's corps marched down Chambersburg Pike, west of Gettysburg, they ran into Union Major General John Buford's 2 cavalry brigades. Buford was outnumbered. Time passed, and his men took heavy losses. But he was able to hold off attacks until support came. Union Major General John Reynolds came to relieve Buford's tired men. Reynolds was in charge of 2 infantry corps, which included the famous Iron Brigade. Before noon, as Reynolds' men took over for Buford's. A single shot struck Reynolds in the back of the neck, killing him instantly and leaving the infantry corps without a leader. Fighting quieted for a couple of hours until about 2 p.m. when Confederate troops attacked McPherson's Ridge and Oak Ridge. Union troops were pushed back through the town.
The firing seemed to be coming nearer and nearer, and at last shells began to plow through the line. When one fell only a short distance from us and exploded, I concluded that I had better make for home.
Fighting went back and forth for several more hours. As night fell, the Union Army had been pushed onto the hills south of the town. Confederates enjoyed relative success, but Lee and his second-in-command, Lieutenant General James Longstreet, were aware that Union troops held high ground and were reinforcing their positions through the night. With darkness came relative silence, but sunrise was not far off. July 2nd, 1863. Early in the morning, commander of the Union Army, Major General George Gordon Meade, arrived at the site of the Union position. He planned to either attack Lee's forces from the hills or defend the hills from an attack. Keeping high ground was his priority. Against Longstreet's wishes, General Lee decided to attack the Union position. Both armies spent most of the morning fortifying their positions, getting into position, and preparing for battle. The Union lines were set up in a hook shape along Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and Cemetery Ridge. Confederate troops attacked from the west, north, and northeast. At around 4 p.m., as the afternoon sun beat down, rebel cannons began firing. Union Major General Daniel E. Sickles set up his men along the southern end of the Union line. Instead of staying in the position assigned by General Meade, Major General Daniel Sickles weakened the Union defenses by moving his corps forward and into one of the deadliest engagements of the day. Part of Sickles' line occupied a wheat field where they met heavy fire. Over 6,000 men from both sides were killed, captured, or wounded. Fighting raged all along the Union line for the rest of the afternoon. After a second day of fighting, Confederate and Union troops suffered heavy losses. But Union forces still held high ground. Soldiers and civilians rested.
On this evening, the number of wounded brought to the place was indeed appalling. They were laid in different parts of the house. The orchard and space around the buildings were covered with the shattered and dying, and the barn became more and more crowded. The scene had become terrible beyond description.
Simultaneous Confederate attacks failed, and General Lee was faced with a difficult decision: try again or retreat.
Now let's look at the Battle of Gettysburg in a little bit more detail, day by day. Now, towns across Pennsylvania were being explored for much-needed supplies to try and continue this Confederate offensive. While looking in Gettysburg, Pettigrew's brigade spotted Buford's cavalry on a ridge a mile west of town. So the Battle of Gettysburg began on July 1st with Confederate troops attacking the Union Cavalry Division on McPherson Ridge, just west of town. Outnumbered, the Union forces managed to hold and even drive the Confederate Army back after the addition of John Reynolds' infantry division and Reynolds' subsequent death on the front lines. They prevailed until mid-afternoon when they were overpowered by additional Southern troops and driven back through town. In the confusion, thousands of Union soldiers were captured before they could rally on Cemetery Hill, just south of town. Long into the night, Union troops labored over their defenses while the bulk of Meade's army arrived and took up positions. Day 2. On July 2nd, the battle lines were drawn into two curved lines. The main portions of both armies were nearly a mile apart on two parallel ridges. Union forces on Cemetery Ridge and the famous Fishhook, facing Confederate forces on Seminary Ridge to the west. Lee then ordered an attack on both Union flanks. On the south, James Longstreet's thrust onto the Union left broke through D.E. Sickles' advance lines at the Peach Orchard, left of the Wheatfield and Plum Run, now known as Bloody Run, was strewn with dead and wounded, and then turned on the rocky area now known as Devil's Den at the base of Little Round Top, and just completely demolished that. Only a very observant General G.K. Warren saved Little Round Top for the Union when he saw that that strategic hill was unmanned. To the north, Ewell's attack ultimately proved futile against the entrenched Union right on East Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, even though they were able to take position of the southern slope of Culp's Hill on one occasion. The frequent lack of effective communication would prove the downfall of the Confederacy this day. They'd only known that they were a few hundred yards away from taking Union supply trains. If only Rhodes had moved through the streets of Gettysburg to aid the attack on Cemetery Hill, things might have turned out a lot different. Day 3. On July 3rd, Lee decided to press the attack of the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. At 1 in the afternoon, the Southern artillery opened a bombardment that, for a time, engaged the massed guns on both sides in a thundering duel for supremacy, but did little to soften up the Union battle lines. Then came the climax of the Battle of Gettysburg. With a salute from Longstreet, General George E. Pickett, in a desperate attempt to recapture the partial success of the preceding day, spearheaded one of the most incredible efforts in military history, a massed infantry assault of 15,000 Confederate troops across the open field toward the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. 1 mile they marched, while being pounded by artillery and rifle fire through all of it. Pickett's men managed to reach but failed to break the Union line, and the magnificent effort ended in disaster. The tide of the Confederacy had swept to its crest and receded, and in less than an hour, 10,000 of the assault had become casualties, and this attack, forever known as Pickett's Charge, was now history.
On July 3rd, Lee took an offensive position once again, determined to break through the Union line.
You need to think about one thing. How many times did the Confederate Army invade Pennsylvania in the Civil War? Once. So if you're Lee, will you ever get here again? Will you ever have this opportunity again? You're not going to just walk away from this battlefield.
Anticipating that Meade had strengthened his army's flanks with the majority of his men, Lee decided to attack the less defended Union center. He hoped that enough of his men could survive the mile-long march across the open field to break through the Union line. The enemy would crumble, and the Confederacy would have the greatest victory of the war. Thus began Pickett's Charge. Named for one of its commanders, General George Pickett, the attack sent 3 brigades of Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia against the center line of 5,750 Union men. Hundreds of Confederates fell as they marched across a mile-wide open field, withstanding blistering cannon fire and volley after volley of enemy muskets. By the time they crossed a fence line along the Emmitsburg Road, their numbers had dwindled to a few thousand. They marched on. In the face of devastating musket fire, only a fraction of the Confederates reached the Union defenses. In an inspiring act of courage, these few soldiers broke through the enemy's line, but only for a moment. They were quickly beaten back by thousands of Union reinforcements. This monument, called the High Water Mark, has stood at the farthest point of the Confederate charge for over 100 years. But it may be wrong. 100 yards away sits what some claim to be the true Confederate high water mark, and it's a monument few have ever seen. Placed here in 1999, this plaque memorializes the charge of Lieutenant Colonel Joe Davis and a few of his men from the 11th Mississippi Brigade, who reached closer to the Union line than anyone had realized before. They reached far that day, but not far enough.
Pickett's charge, it signifies the end of the battle for the Confederate Army. They can't continue the battle. And the number of casualties that they take and the amount of artillery ammunition that they expend means that Lee has exhausted the offensive capability of his army after that attack.
The failure of Pickett's charge to break the Union line and the tremendous casualties resulting from the battle sent Lee's army to retreat.
With the failure of Pickett's charge, the battle was over and the Union was saved. Lee's retreat began on the afternoon of July 4th, and behind him, the small town of only 2,400 people was left with a total, now this is a total from both sides, of 51,000 casualties. Over 172,000 men and 634 cannon had been positioned in an area encompassing only 25 square miles. Additionally, an estimated 570 tons of ammunition was expended, and when the battle was over, 5,000 dead horses and other wreckage of war presented a scene of just terrible devastation. And our final video is going to outline the Confederate mistakes that were made at Gettysburg and how those mistakes ultimately cost them the war.
Why was Pickett's charge ordered in the first place? The answer may lie in the personality of the man who made the decisions. There was no general more knowledgeable or more strategically brilliant than Robert E. Lee. But could he have made a series of catastrophic blunders that led to the defeat of the South? Could Lee have underestimated the enemy and overestimated his own troops?
I think it's impossible to overstate the confidence with which Lee and his army marched north in June and July 1863. Lee believed that his infantry could accomplish anything. He'd seen them accomplish prodigious feats at Chancellorsville in early May 1863 and on other fields before that. And the men, in turn, had seen Lee put them in positions where they won dramatic victories against very long odds.
At Lee's side was his most trusted officer, General James Longstreet. Sensing disaster on the morning of the attack, Longstreet repeatedly tried to dissuade Lee from making the assault, arguing that Lee's plan was too hazardous.
When Lee and Longstreet initially were discussing how many men were going to be in the attack, how many infantry, Lee had said, ballpark figure, he said 15,000. And Longstreet responded to that by saying, you'd need at least 30,000 men to make this attack. And he said even then the issue would be in doubt. You have to keep in mind that Longstreet had conducted some pretty big attacks in this war. So he knew what he was talking about when he was saying that many soldiers.
But 30,000 men would be more than a third of Lee's army. Too many men to risk in a single attack. Lee, certain of his men's capability to fight, felt confident that half of Longstreet's number could take the hill, and he ordered Longstreet to proceed. Despite his serious concerns about Lee's plan, Longstreet accepted his orders and formulated his attack.
So, how are you going to succeed if you're going to attack the center? You're going to succeed by mustering an overwhelming force with overwhelming firepower. So you'll concentrate the largest number of guns anybody's done in the war up to this point and smash the Union center with artillery fire. Follow it up with enough infantry to be decisive. That's what he's thinking. He thinks his artillery can silence the Union artillery, disrupt the Union infantry, and his infantry will take the position.
But Longstreet was so distressed about Lee's plan, he would not trust himself to direct the attack. Instead, in a move that startles historians to this day, he handed the responsibility of calling the attack to his 28-year-old artillery commander, E.P. Alexander. Here is where the chain of command begins to unravel.
When Longstreet knew that he was going to be in charge, he then tried to shift the responsibility to the shoulders of Edward Porter Alexander, who wasn't even a general, but was in command of the artillery bombardment. I think Longstreet was simply not willing to be the one who was going to be responsible for sending these troops forward.
Colonel Alexander organized his cannons along the top of Seminary Ridge. For General Lee's plan to work, Alexander's guns would have to demoralize the center of the Union line.
This is the key. The Confederates have to take these batteries out to pave the way for the infantry. At 1 o'clock, the Confederate artillery is going to open up. There's about 150 Confederate cannon that are firing, so we can get an idea of what this sound is like. They're firing about a round a minute. There's 150 guns firing about a round a minute. That means the Confederate artillery, the shells are exploding about this fast on Cemetery Ridge.
The Confederate cannons were having some effect. Union ammunition was seen exploding high into the air. But more often than not, Confederate cannons were missing their mark. Proof of this disaster can be found easily if you know where to look. Just 400 yards behind the Union lines to the Leicester family house, which General Meade had commandeered for his headquarters the day before. A photograph taken just days after the battle shows an enormous amount of damage to the stone walls and fences. Careful examination reveals that this destruction was made by Confederate artillery fire, intended for the Union line. Here is our first glimpse at one of the many hidden adversities that plagued Pickett's charge. The Confederate cannons were ordered to destroy the Union artillery at the center of the line. But they were overshooting their targets, and they never knew it. The question immediately arises: how could the Confederate artillery have missed so badly?
I believe the Confederate artillery was ineffective for a number of reasons. I think the most important one is that throughout the war, the Confederates had enormous problems with the quality of their fuses, the timed fuses that dictated when the rounds would explode. They almost never could count on the rounds exploding when they were supposed to. Another factor is the enormous amount of smoke that was generated very quickly made it difficult for the Confederates to determine the effectiveness and the range of their fire.
The Union artillery also struggled with the smoke, firing many rounds that missed their targets. Some of the Union misfires fell among the Confederate men as they waited for their orders to attack. It's estimated that nearly 500 soldiers were hit by the Union's shells. At approximately 1:40 p.m., with his ammunition running out, E.P. Alexander sent a note to General George Pickett.
The 18 guns have been driven off. For God's sake, come on quick, or we cannot support you. Ammunition nearly out.
When Alexander's note reached General Pickett, the division commander from Virginia was unsure about taking commands from a subordinate. Pickett went to his commander, General Longstreet, for orders.
When Pickett came up to him and asked if he could advance, Longstreet was so overcome with emotion, he couldn't even say anything to him. So that does give us some idea of his state of mind on July 3rd.
With just a nod, Longstreet allowed his men to charge headlong into a hail of Union artillery. Though the exact numbers are unknown, Lee's men were clearly taking more casualties than he would have expected. The question is why? The answer lies in part on the features of the battlefield. The field of Pickett's charge appears to be level, but in fact, 3 significant ridges divided into thirds. The Cemetery Ridge, where the Union defensive line had been established, the Seminary Ridge, on which Alexander had aligned his cannons, and the Emmitsburg Road Ridge, which separated the two armies. It was this ridge that surprised the Confederate troops and left them vulnerable as they marched across the field.
When you look at the terrain, you have to understand that in certain places, Union artillery could be hidden up until the last moment. The Confederates couldn't see it. So the Confederates were kept, in a sense, guessing of what the strength was here.
What might the charging Confederate men have seen as they marched across the open fields?
We're following the path of Pickett's divisions, at least some of it, coming up from a shallow and coming up to a rise here.
A flag marks the location of the Union artillery position, but it's blocked from view by the Emmitsburg Ridge. Only after coming up onto the rise in the middle of the field can the Union cannons be seen. Robert E. Lee knew how to command soldiers, but Lee may have misread the geography of the battlefield that lay right in front of him. The lack of accurate intelligence and the overwhelming enemy artillery fire destroyed the charging troops. As the Confederates were taking losses from the Union shells, men were being lost in other ways as well. An entire brigade fled under fire, reducing the Confederate troops by hundreds. Those men were not cowards. The stress of 20 minutes of incoming artillery fire proved to be too much before they broke for the safety of their lines.
Artillery doesn't have to kill a person, no. Its idea is to discourage infantry from wanting to go across open fields. So, a hit can be good, but a near miss can even work better. You don't have to hit the target, just be close enough to make them think twice. And that's what artillery is supposed to do.
The remainder of the men maintained their charge, holding their fire until they were in close range.
You had about 5.5% of all casualties in the American Civil War caused by artillery. I would have to say during this charge that it had to be at least twice that.
What if not all the Confederate troops even made the final charge? If there were fewer targets, the numbers of casualties would have been lower. But is there reason to think that some men were not involved in the final assault?
The accounts that I'm getting from some witnesses suggest that a lot of the Confederates decided to turn around and walk off the field. It's not cowardice. These are veterans. It's common sense. And there's enough eyewitness accounts to piece that together.
When the Confederates come up and over the rise, about 550 yards away from the Union position, they're about 100 yards away from the Emmitsburg Road, where there are two 5-foot fences, one on either side of the road.
This post and rail fence marks the point of no return for the Confederates in the charge. One very similar to this stood here during the battle. The Confederates had to cross over this sturdy thing, go into a 2-foot sunken road, and then recross over another fence just like this under small arms fire and artillery fire. They were devastated. Most of the men who crossed the road here did not return.
The fences along the Emmitsburg Road created a hazard not anticipated by the field commanders, which proved to be a fatal mistake. Realizing their situation, the Confederate commanders ordered the men to keep moving, to climb the fence and then reform their lines before advancing against the enemy.
Forward! Guard!
The tactics of battle called for these men to reform after climbing the fence and carry the fight to the enemy. Clearly, many soldiers did. In a letter written after the war, the answer may be found. John H. Moore of the 7th Tennessee wrote that as he climbed the fence and looked back, there seemed to remain a line of battle in the road. What Moore saw was approximately half the men from 2 of Lee's divisions remaining at Emmitsburg Road, clinging to the shelter of the ditches by the road.
One of the biggest problems during Pickett's charge will be the Emmitsburg Road. The road itself was a bit of a sunken road, and thousands of Confederates took position in the sunken road and got no further.
When you look at the casualty returns, what's interesting is that 55% of all the Confederate casualties are captured, and that almost half of those are men who are not wounded. These were men who decided that we better live to fight another time.
An estimated 1,000 soldiers were captured and taken to prison for the remainder of the war. Most were found at the Emmitsburg Road, hiding behind any slight rise that offered shelter. It's a clear indication that many men made no attempt to engage in the final assault. If this is the case, the casualty numbers would be less than previously estimated, because many of the Confederate soldiers remained out of the range of the Union guns. They reached the fence, realized the futility of making the charge, and refused to move on. Those who reached into the Union line were following two of Lee's more aggressive generals. They had also crossed the fence line farther from the Union line, making them more difficult targets to hit. As Lee's men returned, battered and defeated, the general recognized the possibility of a Union counterattack. At the height of the battle, Lee called for Pickett to organize his men and brace for a Union assault.
Lee was trying to get his officers to help him make the men rally, and when he saw Pickett, he tried to get Pickett to do so, and Pickett was absolutely incapable or unwilling to do so. Pickett, in effect, said, "My division is ruined, it can't be rallied," and he made his way onto the rear. I think that's an incredible scene. There's almost nothing else like it in the entire history of the Army of Northern Virginia, when Lee would ask a subordinate to do something and the subordinate, in effect, said, "I can't do it," and walked away.
Which brings us to our assignment for today. Now, I want you to keep this worksheet because we're not done with it yet. You will need it for tomorrow's assignment. So keep that, and it's also going to be very helpful to you as a study tool as we prepare for the Civil War test, which is coming up in the very, very near future. All right, thank you for watching, and if you have any questions, please come and find me. Have a great rest of your day.